Blood intertwined at a crime scene always tells a terrifying story, especially when the victim's genetic profile tangles directly with their attacker. We constantly encounter these biological collisions between predators and their prey, turning microscopic evidence into a crucial puzzle. Forget about dates, names, or tallying up the agonizing days since Nancy Guthrie vanished into the night. The absolute core of this massive manhunt boils down to a single haunting digit. That figure represents a precise genetic fraction currently locked away inside a Florida testing facility. Detectives are convinced this microscopic trace belongs to the phantom who breached that house, dragged an 84-year-old woman into the unknown, and remained entirely nameless for more than 66 grueling days. Federal agents possess those exact figures right alongside the planet's absolute top genetic sleuth. Her recent assessment delivered a devastating blow that left everyone stunned, so stick around. The foundational facts of this nightmare are already etched in your mind. 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie, whose daughter hosts a major morning broadcast, vanished from her Catalina Foothills residence right around 9:45 on the evening of January 31st following a quiet family meal. Following her ride home, she stepped through her front door and completely disappeared. Detectives soon discovered her confirmed blood drops scattered across the entry, while the rear exit sat suspiciously ajar. Medical monitors violently lost connection with her implanted heart device at 2:28 on February 1st. Before that, her security lens died at 1:47. Deep into that Sunday morning, the front surveillance blacked out at 1:47. Moments later at 2:12, digital sensors caught human movement. Crime scene technicians sweeping the interior uncovered bodily fluids that absolutely did not belong entirely distinct from the crimson stains outside. They secured an unexplained biological payload left by a total stranger. This mystery profile failed to align with any single person operating within the victim's immediate social circle. Relatives, household employees, and regular visitors were entirely ruled out as the source of this microscopic fingerprint. The local sheriff publicly verified this breakthrough on February 19th. Law enforcement leadership recently announced a strategic pivot toward advanced ancestral tracking to hunt down potential suspects linked to this harrowing abduction. Science professionals caught wind of this development and reacted with a rapid, fiercely unified perspective. Veteran ancestry experts echoed an identical resounding sentiment across the board. Possessing the perpetrator's genetic code guarantees an eventual resolution to this mystery. We expect rapid answers rather than decades of waiting, since the required databases and technology operate flawlessly. Historical success rates validate this aggressive approach time and time again. Process the extraction quickly, and an identity will inevitably surface, according to the lead analyst heading operations at Parabon Nanolabs. Her personal track record includes cracking over 300 frozen investigations armed only with ancestral algorithms. She boldly offered her insights long before the severe evidentiary hurdles became apparent. The perpetrator should be sweating bullets at this exact moment, because modern chromosomal tracking guarantees his unmasking. Providing the attacker possessed extensive American lineage, stretching back several centuries, pinpointing his exact identity might require merely a handful of minutes or a brief afternoon. She passionately expressed her desire for this precise caliber of clues to emerge during the initial investigation, that optimistic stance defined February. Everything drastically shifted around February 20th. The lead investigator faced the press again, dropping a solitary term that violently derailed the entire scientific Genetic profiles frequently bleed together into complicated messes. Our recovered fluids are heavily contaminated with overlapping markers, forcing us to meticulously untangle them while desperately attempting to save enough remnants for future courtroom battles. Biological evidence scraped from the residence completely lacked a pristine, singular signature. It proved to be a chaotic blend. Several distinct human sequences collided within one tiny droplet, mutating a massive investigative leap into a devastatingly intricate riddle that authorities confessed might demand nearly a year to untangle. Specialized scientists caught wind of this brutal setback and immediately demanded answers. How severely convoluted was this biological cocktail? When the dreadful truth finally dropped, it carried more weight than every single press briefing combined up until that devastating moment. The lead genealogist openly admitted her initial reaction upon learning about the contaminated evidence pulled from the residence. Panic never set in initially. Brutal altercations practically guarantee an overlapping mess of bodily fluids, as desperate fights for survival naturally leave behind multiple cellular fingerprints. Ancestral sleuths rarely worry about the mere existence of blended fluids. Their entire focus rests strictly on analyzing that chemical overlap. Handling a two-person puddle where the attacker leaves barely a trace beneath the victim's overwhelming profile presents a completely solvable hurdle. Modern testing facilities possess established protocols for this. Specialized data analysts confidently navigate these muddy waters. The extraction demands patience, Yet leading experts consider these blended drops highly beneficial. Uncovering a faint but distinct secondary signature from an intruder who absolutely should not be there changes everything. This anomalous trace violently contrasts against the overwhelming native genetics. That tiny droplet basically becomes a neon sign identifying the attacker. The analysts characterize the finding as a deeply convoluted mess. We are dealing with a minimum of 2 completely unidentified ghosts. Forget a simple clash between the homeowner and a single male assailant. This microscopic soup features several entirely anonymous biological participants. Days bled into agonizing weeks, stretching beyond a full month at the private Florida testing center, deliberately selected over elite federal facilities. Technicians ran the complicated extraction protocols, yet they yielded absolute silence, failing to generate a single viable profile or ancestral breadcrumb for desperate detectives. The leading expert nervously monitored the calendar, interpreting this silence as a terrible omen. She routinely watched tougher puzzles crack within days. Top-tier facilities routinely conjure brilliant investigative directions from nightmare samples before a week even finishes. Yet this particular evaluation stalled completely out of sight. Upon hearing the sheriff publicly suggest a 12-month waiting period, the seasoned specialist translated the terrifying reality hidden beneath his bureaucratic timeline. His vague statement subtly confessed that authorities were literally praying for scientific capabilities to catch up with their current nightmare. That practically screams that every existing analytical program and brilliant data scientist has utterly failed to conquer the impossibly dense biological web currently suffocating this specific manhunt. Grasping the true horror of this delay requires a deep, uncompromising look into the exact mechanics powering modern ancestral tracking algorithms. Forget everything you know about standard federal databases because CODIS will not save us here. The FBI relies on this massive system to track convicted criminals holding roughly 20 million genetic signatures on file. When investigators plug mystery evidence into that framework, they essentially get a simple yes or no answer. Authorities already ran Guthrie's biological clues through that standard process. They came up completely empty. The phantom who dropped those bodily traces at the New York residence simply lacks any prior federal convictions. Standard police networks are totally useless for cracking this particular mystery. Cutting-edge ancestral tracking operates on a completely unique methodology, demanding a vastly more complex biological blueprint to function properly. Rather than checking against files of convicted felons, specialized researchers construct something known as a single nucleotide polymorphism panel. Picture the concept like this. Standard forensic testing acts merely as a basic police composite sketch, providing just enough detail to verify someone who is already sitting inside an interrogation room. Conversely, these advanced genealogical panels serve as highly detailed schematics of a subject's entire bloodline. They reveal far beyond individual identity, mapping out exact historical lineage alongside currently breathing family members. Commercial heritage kits produce this exact variety of deep biological data. Millions of citizens happily mail in their swabs, hoping to uncover lost kin or chart historical migration paths. Folks love exploring their roots or satisfying basic curiosities regarding ancestral origins. Once experts successfully build that comprehensive genetic map for an unidentified perpetrator, they feed the information into open-source heritage websites rather than confidential police networks. Utilizing commercial hubs, where everyday folks willingly surrendered personal genetic details, intentionally leaving their familial records, completely visible. Computer programs never actually hunt for the killer directly. The software specifically hunts down individuals sharing biological markers with the target. Think along the lines of second cousins or distant kin sharing a great-great-grandparent. Literally any user whose uploaded chromosomes overlap sufficiently enough to prove they share an ancient relative somewhere along their bloodline. Using those hits, researchers carefully reconstruct the lineage, moving systematically through every single generation. Detectives link each hit to recognize kin tracking those folks backward, using public archives until pinpointing the exact spot where all bloodlines intersect. Those lines ultimately intersect at one specific target, possessing the matching gender and correct approximate age, the proper regional ties, and the perfect lifestyle profile to realistically be the masked figure caught on surveillance footage. CC Moore explained to the cable news network that this method essentially deconstructs a suspect's identity backward using only biological heritage. Experts rebuild the target's entire lineage step by step, relying purely on genetic overlaps with strangers. They literally stitch the historical timeline back together, one forefather at a time. His identity remains hidden, yet investigators easily pinpoint the identities of his distant genetic matches. That is the true magic here, because authorities never actually require the perpetrator's own biological submission. Finding just a handful of cooperative distant kin is perfectly sufficient. that exact strategy ultimately unmasked Joseph James DeAngelo, the notorious Golden State Killer who spent 40 years dodging justice for countless crimes. Detectives utilized identical tactics to capture Brian Kohberger for the Idaho homicides, tracking an ancestral breadcrumb trail sparked by one distant cousin's commercial testing kit. This methodology remains incredibly well established, court-approved, and blindingly fast, assuming all the preliminary variables line up perfectly. However, the entire operation hinges entirely on one absolute necessity. Before launching, researchers must secure a workable genetic panel. Contaminated blends are totally useless, and scrambled data gets rejected immediately. Heritage websites simply cannot hunt down kin using biological markers heavily muddled by multiple different people. Experts must first execute a rigorous computational breakdown, relying on heavy math to isolate that messy evidence into pristine individualized biological signatures. That separation phase must absolutely work, yielding a refined sequence packed with enough identifying markers to generate useful familial hits across those public platforms. When extraction fails, the whole investigation freezes completely. Analysts lack viable data to upload platforms, remain unsearched pedigrees, stay unmapped, and the shadowy culprit avoids identification entirely. Furthermore, a massive accessibility hurdle exists, an issue mainstream television broadcasts consistently fail to highlight when discussing this investigation. Globally, the top 3 commercial genetic networks, which are Ancestry, 23andMe alongside MyHeritage, collectively harbor over 50 million user records. Yet every single one actively blocks police from browsing their vaults. These corporations took a firm moral stance, guaranteeing paying customers that their biology would never assist police inquiries. Moore warned reporters that even bearing legal warrants, authorities face a brutal, drawn-out courtroom war just to breach those digital gates. Backed by immense wealth and aggressive corporate lawyers, these sites ferociously defend consumer privacy. Consequently, prying open their archives becomes an agonizingly sluggish ordeal. Authorities are basically restricted to searching through GED match family tree, DNA, and Moore's personal database, DNA Justice, which altogether contained fewer than 2 million profiles. 50 million compared to barely 2 million completely illustrates the staggering mathematical disadvantage facing detectives today. The overwhelming majority of commercial genetic data that could theoretically unmask this killer sits heavily guarded behind corporate firewalls that authorities simply cannot legally breach. Consequently, the remaining universe they are allowed to scan represents a minuscule fraction of what is truly required for consistent results. Throw another massive complication into the mix, those limited 2 million available entries suffer from incredibly skewed demographic representation. White individuals boasting deep Northwestern European roots who possess multi-generational American heritage completely dominate the searchable datasets. Meanwhile, newer citizens, folks hailing from Latin America, Africa, or Southeast Asia, alongside anyone deliberately avoiding the commercial swabbing craze entirely. They and their extended families likely remain completely invisible to the software. Therefore, success relies heavily on 2 specific factors: extracting an untainted sequence initially, and hoping the culprit's kin actually belong to that tiny fraction of 2 million users, willingly exposing their data to authorities. Without both criteria aligning perfectly, the entire ancestral tracking strategy collapses before it even starts. Highly esteemed biological researcher Colleen Fitzpatrick explained this exact dynamic to the National Broadcasting Company shortly after the New York vanishing. She never relied on leaked case details, nor was she merely repeating confidential briefing notes whispered by lead detectives. She merely acted like any good scientist, translating an incredibly dense technical hurdle so everyday people could understand. Bloodlines trace beautifully from shattered genetic fragments, yet they completely fall apart when multiple biological signatures collide. Your primary target must dominate the material overwhelmingly, ideally maintaining a clear 90-to-10 ratio over unknown sources. At first glance, this feels completely manageable since your target's biological trace undeniably exists right there inside the gathered evidence. Fitzpatrick noted how forensic technicians successfully handled clean 90-10 splits involving exactly 2 distinct biological sources in past casework. Any biological trace inevitably forms a complicated blend, completely overwhelmed by Guthrie's profile, defying standard extraction procedures using national databases. Untangling it remains brutally tough, even though programs handled comparable ratios before prompting her to ask an absolute game-changing question. Does that faint 10% trace hold enough sheer quality and volume to yield the necessary markers for viable profiling? Or rather, can analysts accurately extract enough data to feed Ancestry servers, eventually producing actionable family ties for dedicated researchers? That remains the pivotal hurdle here, and Fitzpatrick bluntly warned how a minor 10% fraction simply might fail completely. Those crucial identifiers might technically exist, yet lack sufficient volume, creating a digital whisper way too weak to construct anything. Lacking adequate data points means an unfinished blueprint, and without that comprehensive map, investigators remain locked out of powerful ancestral servers. Without server access, ancestral branches disappear, and missing those branches means you never uncover a real identity. Next, she introduced another massive hurdle, instantly turning a difficult puzzle into a seemingly impenetrable scientific barricade. What if multiple people contributed Sheriff Nanos never explicitly framed this collected evidence as a simple two-person blend? He specifically kept mentioning a blend of genetic codes, stating how the biological evidence recovered right from that location contains completely entangled profiles. This requires intense separation, which hopefully the technicians achieve, while actively saving enough residual material just in case opposing counsel demands independent testing. Inside investigative laboratories, such wording carries heavy weight since it rarely guarantees just two biological donors. It easily points toward 3, maybe even 4 distinct sources converging inside a horribly compromised location. We mean an environment serving as the casualty's long-term home, heavily trafficked by completely different people over countless overlapping timeframes. Every shred of those overlapping organic traces easily clumps together within one microscopic swab lifted off a single isolated countertop. Entangled genetic interpretation heavily relies upon predictive algorithms that thrive when evidence holds two distinct sources with an easily distinguishable balance. These digital systems effectively attribute every single detected identifier toward its likeliest owner, boasting enough mathematical certainty to generate a totally functional blueprint. Systems isolate the overwhelming primary profile, first carefully plucking secondary traces from whatever scattered data gets mathematically ignored. Throwing a third mysterious individual into the mix violently complicates the entire algorithm, forcing every single data point to straddle 3 entirely separate probability curves. Predictive certainty drops sharply, instantly inflating the inherent error rate across every single individual mathematical assignment. Processing engines strain profoundly just to achieve the absolute bare minimum accuracy standards demanded for ancestry server queries or eventual legal battles. A fourth hidden presence doesn't simply double the chaos. Instead, the algorithmic nightmare fractures exponentially. Every new participant drastically inflates the potential biological combinations those processors must evaluate, ultimately defining the exact breaking point currently halting the Guthrie inquiry. Digital strain hits a brutal ceiling where modern analytics simply cannot deliver confident answers, and it stems neither from cheap hardware nor from missing budgets. It has nothing to do with untrained minds, but rather an absolute mathematical wall, stopping current programs from untangling this heavily contaminated evidence. Leading expert Moore openly validated this brutal entanglement dilemma throughout multiple broadcast interviews spanning February and March of this current year. Leaning on professional laboratory jargon, she actively branded it a highly complicated blend, heavily implying that at least 2 mysterious individuals lurk inside. It completely skips being a basic concoction containing merely the victim's trace alongside a single unidentified male. She confessed that once the endless waiting period vastly outlasted any typical timeline for standard dual-source cases, pushing way beyond expectations for even terribly stubborn two-person puzzles, her mind ultimately settled upon one grim realization. The cutting-edge algorithms and brilliant digital geneticists currently deployed are flat-out failing to unravel this specific evidence, leaving them desperately praying for major technological breakthroughs sometime within the next several years. News Nation anchor Natasha Zves pushed her incredibly hard on the Truth of the Matter broadcast. Does this basically mean you suspect the required analytic machinery might entirely be pure science fiction today? The required programs completely lack real-world availability. A harsh reality, more confirmed bluntly, while explicitly tying federal limitations back to the overarching historical progression of these investigative sciences. Unraveling strategies for legacy genetic footprints spent 30 years evolving, resulting in incredibly robust analytical programs repeatedly validated throughout fierce judicial battles. Dedicated criminalistic experts essentially polished those particular investigative engines through 30 uninterrupted years of heavy active duty and intense scholarly review. Meanwhile, extracting advanced biological markers strictly for ancestral tracking operates under entirely different mechanics and remains an incredibly juvenile frontier. The digital framework designed to transform a chaotic organic blend into a pristine ancestral map sits precisely as Moore described it at absolute ground zero. This methodology barely crawled out of its infancy looking hopelessly fresh when stacked against those established legacy techniques investigators masterfully refined over several long decades. That exact technological chasm dividing rock-solid national database analytics from incredibly fragile modern ancestral extraction programs essentially swallowed the entire Guthrie investigation completely whole. Yet Moore promises unstoppable momentum, eagerly highlighting absolutely explosive developmental strides made throughout her dedicated 7.5 years pushing this exact scientific envelope. A brilliant mind out there might already be coding the exact algorithm to untangle this messy genetic web, she boldly admitted. Her exact words were clear: "I won't rule out the possibility that a tech genius is actively building the perfect tool to fix this." Hopefully this massive hurdle sparks fresh ingenuity, pushing brilliant up-and-coming researchers to step up and showcase the experimental tools they have been quietly perfecting. With the intense national spotlight locked onto the Guthrie mystery, that massive industry pressure alone could trigger the exact technological breakthrough investigators desperately need. High-stakes manhunts have historically sparked major scientific leaps, just like the Golden State Killer hunt single-handedly mainstreamed genetic genealogy for police departments nationwide. While this tragedy could certainly fast-track the creation of advanced separation algorithms, relying on uninvented technology remains purely speculative right now. Today, that crucial swab sits unread in a Florida laboratory. However, another massive bureaucratic reality regarding this specific genetic clue demands our immediate attention. Nanos definitively bypassed Quantico, opting to outsource the genetic sequencing to DNA Labs International instead of utilizing the Federal Bureau's free resources. Ex-Surgeon General Richard Carmona loudly touted Quantico as the nation's premier taxpayer-funded facility that works for free. When pressed, C.C. Moore offered a much more diplomatic perspective. According to her, the private facility wields highly specialized SNP profiling tools severely lacking at federal headquarters, hypothetically shrinking the timeline by running traditional criminal database checks and advanced ancestral tracing at the exact same time. We simply cannot determine yet if sidestepping the federal government was a brilliant tactical move. The undeniable truth remains we know exactly where the swabs are housed and precisely how little progress happened over 66 days. Before dropping the actual figure, you need to grasp the massive background details, because bare statistics mean absolutely nothing. Framed correctly, this specific digit acts as a devastating expert ruling on the single most critical forensic clue in this entire ongoing manhunt. Elite ancestral investigator Colleen Fitzpatrick brutally laid out the grim statistics for NBC. Imagine the genetic puddle from the residence splitting into 90% of the homeowner's material and 10% mysterious suspect. 9 out of 10 microscopic markers pulled from that fluid essentially point back to the longtime resident who suffered. That leaves merely a 10% fraction linking directly to the masked, heavily armed phantom who snatched her away into the darkness. Completely she always show me for unrecognized. That minuscule sliver simply will not cut it, Fitzpatrick warned, meaning technicians cannot harvest enough viable data from such a tiny trace to trigger a legitimate ancestral match. She also dropped a terrifying hypothetical imagine if multiple strangers contaminated that exact spot. Having countless microscopic traces bleeding together amplifies the technical chaos, creating a genetic nightmare completely unsolvable by today's most advanced computer parsing programs. C.C. Moore backed up this grim reality, verifying the catastrophic biological entanglement. Watching an entire 12 months evaporate practically screamed to her that modern analytical tools simply cannot untangle this specific mess. Next, she delivered the absolute worst-case scenario that terrified every single detective working on this manhunt. Whenever my ancestral branches cluster heavily around the actual attack site, tracing becomes agonizingly difficult, she noted. It means the phantom possesses massive local ties, drowning the search in hundreds of closely related cousins. This wasn't some gentle warning about unfortunate delays or temporary scientific hurdles. She explicitly destroyed any comforting illusions that detectives were actively inching toward a neat, impending genetic match. Highly doubtful this specific clue cracks the mystery, declared the undisputed master who successfully broke 300 previously unsolvable cases. This harsh reality check arrived from the planet's premier ancestral sleuth, the exact same expert who practically beamed with optimism back in February regarding the mystery swab. Swabs. We are talking about Parabon Nanolabs' top mind, the absolute trailblazer, who single-handedly weaponized ancestry databases to obliterate the nation's most famously stagnant, deeply frozen manhunts. She speaks with brutal clarity, born from raw, hands-on laboratory experience, completely ignoring sensationalized media spin in favor of hard, unyielding biological facts. Deeming the swab utterly useless carries a devastating, crushing finality, especially since this grim verdict comes from an active practitioner, not a pundit. Dismiss the talking heads on cable news. She represents the absolute highest authority in America regarding the viability of hopelessly degraded microscopic crime scene traces. Her warning remains crystal clear if the biological contamination levels perfectly align with what these preliminary laboratory reports strongly suggest. The residential swabs have officially hit a permanent technological brick wall, showing zero signs of crumbling fast enough to secure any justice for Nancy Guthrie. Let us heavily clarify this bleak situation to prevent panic. This absolute scientific stall does not automatically terminate the broader manhunt. Federal agents still possess unturned stones, and we absolutely refuse to accept that the shadowy prowler captured on surveillance will successfully dodge identification forever. Justice might still capture the monster who ambushed an 84-year-old grandmother in her sleep. However, the exact implications of this ruined clue remain incredibly grim and terrifyingly precise. Detectives fundamentally stake their entire public strategy on this specific, microscopic miracle ripped straight from the victim's devastated living room. That highly publicized biological fluid, practically paraded by authorities last February as a silver bullet, has officially maxed out the absolute limits of modern genetic profiling capabilities. Right after validating everyone's worst fears about the degraded swabs, C.C. Moore dropped a massive bombshell that violently flipped the entire trajectory of this seemingly doomed conversation. Having just outlined exactly how a tiny fraction of suspect fluid trapped inside a messy puddle utterly breaks our best laboratory computers, she suddenly shifted gears entirely. The victim was imprisoned somewhere else, she declared, revealing that uncovering a secondary holding location instantly resets the genetic hunt. Make absolutely no mistake, this was no empty comfort. She refused to peddle false hope just to sugarcoat the incredibly massive technological failures. Instead, a master tactician perfectly mapped out a highly legitimate, biologically sound alternative route to catch a killer completely bypassing the software glitch. This brilliant backup plan effortlessly sidesteps the nightmare ratios and tangled genetic puddles currently stonewalling the primary investigation. A brutal truth haunts this case. The exact spot where Nancy Guthrie was dragged after vanishing from the Catalina foothills remains an active crime scene. Think of every getaway car, hidden room, or remote stretch of road as an evidence goldmine. Every single place the captor trapped or moved her could hide the exact genetic clues needed to catch him. This new location wouldn't be completely overwhelmed by 60 years of Nancy's own DNA profile. This highlights the fatal flaw of testing her residence. To understand the science, you have to look at the undeniable forensic reality. Her genetic markers aren't just hovering in the background because an attack happened. They dominate the space from decades of simply living there, marking every corner she ever brushed past. From tiny drops of blood to stray hairs resting on armchairs from morning coffee mugs, to the very walls she brushed against on a daily basis. Her physical footprint is practically baked into the foundation. This means any microscopic trace left by an outside intruder faces an uphill battle to stand out. The perpetrator's biological material is hopelessly buried underneath the absolute thickest layer of the victim's everyday genetic evidence. The attacker lingered there for roughly 40 minutes while Nancy called it home for decades. Finding another spot flips the script entirely. The kidnapper's getaway car would heavily feature his own genetic fingerprint. Any hidden shelter used to stash her would primarily carry the genetic markers of its previous tenants. Detectives could easily swab those previous tenants to rule them out, meaning the attacker's traces wouldn't be fighting through 6 long decades of Nancy's background noise. His clues are resting on completely foreign surfaces, which totally transforms the lab's testing capabilities. Moore stated this incredibly clearly during her recent News Nation interview. Securing a clean sample means they can track this monster down using advanced genetic genealogy. I am fully confident a breakthrough will emerge from this exact method. She strongly suspects a secondary or even tertiary location exists out there. They had to move Nancy, which means another hideout definitely exists. Every vehicle taken and every safe house used is a massive opportunity to gather fresh biological evidence, completely bypassing the contamination nightmare at the main house. Moore tossed out another critical piece of advice that the authorities might have completely ignored. She aggressively pushed cops to retest the entire property, regardless of whether the family had already moved back in and accidentally dragged fresh contamination through the halls. She stressed that genetic material is extremely resilient, clinging to objects far longer than expected. Even an invisible, rootless strand of hair can crack a modern investigation wide open. She then highlighted a crucial visual from the security footage. The intruder seemingly clenched a tactical flashlight between his teeth while ransacking the property for roughly 40 minutes. Moore offered a razor-sharp analysis of this specific tactical move. There is no way he gripped that light in his jaw for 40 straight minutes. Taking it out even once would instantly smear his saliva across the exterior of his gloves. He inevitably touched a surface somewhere in that room. Forensic scientists consider saliva one of the absolute most reliable gold mines for extraction. Pulling that light out or breathing without a mask practically guarantees he dropped biological clues. Those exact traces could still be resting on an untested countertop right now. The clues are patiently waiting for detectives who finally understand where the initial science fell short. Moore made it crystal clear genetic evidence is actually incredibly tough to destroy. If the cops missed his profile, it is undoubtedly still hiding inside that residence. They must go back and swab again. Ruling out the family's newer footprints is incredibly easy. That warning highlights a dark political shadow that has plagued the department's handling of this investigation since the very first day. Richard Carmona, the former Surgeon General and past sheriff, slammed Chris Nanos for a catastrophic mistake. He criticized Nanos for prematurely reopening the house before the primary investigator finished gathering clues. We were all absolutely baffled when the news broadcast casually reported that the sheriff personally cleared the area. Sheriffs never do that, It is strictly the lead investigator's job to ensure everything is photographed and bagged before releasing it. Carmona stated this clearly on television, prompting severe pushback from Nanos. Refusing to back down, the current sheriff boldly claimed his team executed everything flawlessly. Denying any contamination whatsoever, he laughed off the severe backlash against his leadership as utterly ridiculous. Fed up with the chaos, local supervisors unanimously forced Nanos to testify under oath regarding his troubled professional background and disastrous administrative choices. By March 24th, his own officers delivered a crushing, unanimous vote of no confidence against him. Furious citizens are already actively pushing a massive recall campaign forward. Extensive digging by both major broadcast networks and digital news outlets uncovered shocking internal secrets from deeply connected whistleblowers. The supervisor handed the reins to this massive abduction case had zero prior experience running a murder investigation before taking over the squad. Out of the entire starting roster, only one single investigator possessed over 3 years of actual homicide experience. Furious at the allegations, the embattled sheriff aggressively defended his commanding officer while pointing toward past successful convictions. However, the shocking lack of experience exposed by two independent media giants is now permanently etched into the tragic history of this botched rollout. These are cold, hard administrative truths, rather than wild guesses about Nancy's final moments or attempts to scapegoat one specific individual. This established public record exposes the intense, undeniable scrutiny currently circling this chaotic investigation exposed entirely by the very deputies who were desperately supposed to be tracking her down. This massive administrative failure matters because it taints every single question about forensic lab choices and crime scene integrity. Today is April 7, 2026, marking 66 agonizing days since her kidnapping. Wearing a bright yellow dress, Savannah bravely returned to morning television on April 6th, warmly greeting her audience while pivoting straight into heavy international news. She announced new peace negotiations during that April 6th broadcast, clearly relieved to be sitting back in her familiar studio chair. Stepping into Rockefeller Plaza, she choked back heavy sobs while greeting a massive crowd of supporters. Her mother is still missing, though the desperate search continues. Local authorities claim they have merely pivoted their strategy, dropping significantly from the 400 boots on the ground they originally deployed. Instead, a dedicated unit is hunting down every surviving clue for the long haul. Federal agents are still on it. Fresh tips keep pouring in daily. Officials made a clear promise to keep digging until they either bring Nancy Guthrie home or run completely out of paths to explore. That handwear discovered 2 miles from her property looked exactly like the one seen on the security video. However, investigators tracked it to a local food service worker who had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. That complex genetic evidence found indoors still sits with a specialized testing facility in Florida. Fresh extortion demands just popped up recently. A major entertainment outlet got messages insisting the missing woman was spotted breathing down in Sonora, Mexico. The tipster wrote a message claiming he knew her exact location and the abductors warning that the clock was ticking. They received that on a Tuesday, yet separating those genetic markers still has not worked out. Scientists have not built a clear genetic blueprint yet. Ancestry registries remain completely untouched. We still have absolutely no clue who that disguised figure on the video actually is. Still, forensic technology holds a few more tricks up its sleeve. The expert made this point perfectly clear. Wherever they took her could hold pure physical clues completely free of the messy issues plaguing our current evidence. Going over the area again might uncover trace cells ignored during the first sweep. Plus, futuristic sorting programs could emerge within 12 months to suddenly make that messy house evidence completely viable. Registries currently containing under 2 million entries will likely expand. This is highly probable if citizens heed the urgent request to share their personal heritage files with major genetic matching platforms. Just one file shared by a distant cousin of the perpetrator might finally blow this entire mystery wide open. Moving past lab work, detectives desperately need the public factor to push things forward. A real person holds the answers. This criminal did not just pop into existence and vanish into the ether. The attacker mapped out his target's property, daily habits, and local surroundings with terrifying precision. Then he tracked down a firearm alongside a highly unique carrying case. He also acquired a 25-liter hiking bag from a huge discount store, brand combat hand protection, and a hands-free torch. He hid his face completely during the 40-minute ambush. Such intense planning never happens in total secrecy. A bystander noticed details. A clerk sold him gear. A neighbor caught sounds. Federal agents eagerly await your call. Dial 1-800-CALL-FBI or visit their site. The 88 Crime Hotline currently offers $12,000. Local justice advocates and a prominent lawyer added another $100,000 for solid leads over the next 66 days, completely off the record. The digits defining this scientific puzzle are not the only figures worth paying attention to right now. Think about all the silent witnesses holding back crucial secrets. Consider how many untouched areas inside that property still need testing. Count the hidden spots we haven't found yet alongside every single ancestry account capable of exposing the perpetrator's bloodline. By simply sharing genetic heritage files en masse, the public creates endless opportunities for that one perfect clue to land directly on a detective's desk. That biological material left at her residence might actually become the massive victory law enforcement desperately needs. This relies entirely on technology, evolving brand new programs, launching, and experts retesting the swabs, though everything could easily fall apart. The brutal truth from leading industry professionals confirms that our present technological boundaries are severely holding us back. That particular isolated swab probably will not be the magic bullet to solve this mystery. However, authorities are far from running out of clues. We merely hit a single dead end while her loved ones, relentless detectives, eager reporters, and brilliant lab technicians refuse to stop searching for the truth. Anyone holding secrets regarding Nancy Guthrie vanishing should dial 1-800-CALL-FBI or browse their portal. Leaving an unnamed clue is totally fine, because this woman raised children. She has grandkids who miss her. This beloved friend gives everyone the ultimate motivation to never abandon the hunt. Every detail in this feature comes directly from open-source journalism and confirmed official quotes provided by identified individuals. We linked every number, spoken phrase, and scientific evaluation back to fully authenticated origins. Everyone mentioned here remains legally blameless until a judge officially declares them guilty. Keep in mind that we designed this media purely to educate the public. Should you possess any details regarding Nancy Guthrie going missing, dial 1-800-CALL-FBI or head over to their official website immediately. In a world that moves faster every single day, it's easy to forget the simple values that truly define us: kindness, responsibility, and empathy. The story we've just explored reminds us that even the smallest actions can create lasting impact. A word of encouragement, a moment of patience, or a choice to do what's right when it's difficult. These are the quiet decisions that shape not only our lives, but the lives of others. Education is not just about knowledge, it is about becoming a better human being. It teaches us to understand, to listen, and to care. When we choose compassion over indifference, we build stronger communities. When we take responsibility for our actions, we grow into individuals others can trust and respect. The message is clear: never underestimate your influence. You don't need to be powerful to make a difference. You just need to be sincere. Every day is a new opportunity to choose goodness, to inspire others, and to leave the world a little better than you found it. Because in the end, it's not what we achieve that defines us, it's how we treat people along the way